Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us. Welcome to Coffee and Something Stronger. My name is Cody Nord, the Interim Executive Director of Georgia Interfaith Power and Light. Coffee and Something Stronger is a coffee chat style interview show where we talk with faith leaders, practitioners, other academics at the intersections of faith, environmental justice, climate change, and all manner of other social justice issues. And this morning, I have a good friend and a good friend of Gipple, Alice Kies, who's the Vice President of Coastal Conservation with 100 Miles. Alice, thanks for joining us this morning.
Thanks so much for having me, Cody. It's a real pleasure.
So I wanted to start by turning it over to you to see if you could tell us a little bit about how you got into this work and the pieces of your journey that stand out for you.
Wow. Well, I, like a lot of people in the environmental field, I was really drawn to outdoors as a kid. I grew up in Ruston, Louisiana, small town in north central Louisiana. And I loved going to the Ruston Country Club with my dad while he played golf and swimming. I loved going to Lake Darbone with my grandparents and fishing and just playing outside, climbing trees. Um, and But interestingly, when I went through school, I got into when I went to college, I had never realized that you could actually make a living doing environmental work. It seems strange to say though, but in the 70s and 80s when I grew up, the only reason that you went outside was really to hunt or to fish. And so that's part of the reason why I loved going to the lake with my grandpa. And so when I went to school at the University of Southern Mississippi, I learned about environmental biology. And then went on to do a study program at the School for Field Studies in British Columbia, learned all about the actual work that you can do as an environmentalist. And I grew up in a Christian home, have been a Christian all of my life, but never really heard anything about creation care from the pulpit. Again, you went outside to hunt and fish. It was all around human soul issues as opposed to creation. So when I was in graduate school, I met my husband, Tim, and he has been a Christian all his life, and it was very strong environmental, evangelical Christian. And he introduced me to all the writings of people like Cal DeWitt and Peter Harris, Matthew Sleeth, the folks that have been engaged in creation care for decades. And it really gave me a lot of hope that, while I felt like I wasn't fulfilling God's calling, I actually was. I was following my passion and doing what I knew I wanted to do, and what climbing trees, being outside, doing that type of environmental work. But again, it was really uplifting to learn that I'm actually fulfilling God's calling in creation care. So after my husband and I married, we moved to Atlanta, and I worked for the Georgia Conservancy and learned about what it means to be an advocate. When I was in graduate school, I was at the University of Georgia School of Ecology. Eugene Odom was actually still professor emeritus there. And so being at, the School of Ecology with the father of modern ecology was pretty phenomenal. And so I learned a lot about the science. But when it came to advocacy, I learned a ton working at the Georgia Conservancy about the ways strategy, grassroots organizing can really help a community come together for caring for God's earth. It's not the passion isn't enough. You really have to have strategy around the work that you do. And so we lived in Atlanta for about 10 years. My oldest child was born there, and worked for the Georgia Conservancy for a while. And then I went to work for the Environmental Protection Division, the regulatory arm of the Department of Natural Resources. And while I was there, my husband got an opportunity to move to the Georgia coast to be the bird biologist for the Department of Natural Resources. And so we jumped at the opportunity to move away from a big city, and we moved to Brunswick. That was almost 11 years ago. And shortly after we moved to the coast, I had an opportunity to join the R. Howard Dobbs Foundation and work for one of my heroes, Cody Laird, and work with David Whitenauer, who's the president. And in that position, I was invited to help them prioritize their environmental giving. And one of the priorities that the Dobbs Foundation settled on was the Georgia coast. And so it was a real amazing opportunity to help worked with the foundation and to then help found 100 Miles, the organization that I'm working for and representing now. It was about 7 years ago that 100 Miles was founded. And in those 7 years, the organization itself has grown tremendously. We work on a lot of issues at the state capitol. We work on local issues. Our mission is to preserve, protect, and enhance Georgia's coast through education, advocacy, and community engagement. And it's been an amazing, amazing journey. But during those 7 years also, our family has grown tremendously. We've adopted 3, you were asking me about my family earlier. Our crazy family is now at 6. So we have 3 adopted babies and our natural born baby. So we have 4 children. And I would say that the coast really defines us. 2 of my babies are of Gullah Geechee descent, which is fantastic. So we try to celebrate the Gullah Geechee culture of coastal Georgia as much as we can. We get out to the river as much as we can. The Satilla River is our favorite because of the sandbars and flopping around and just being wild and crazy in the outdoors. And we've also had the pleasure of working, my husband and I have had the pleasure of working with a small group of people to help start a new church here in Brunswick. It's called Union City Church, and it's led by Drew Thompson and Corey Ingram. And it's a very small church. We meet in the Boys and Girls Club over at one of the elementary schools. But the purpose of the church is really to deal with racial reconciliation. And so it's something that is really close to our heart. And it's something that I'm able to do in my professional life as well as my personal life. And so I can't say enough about how much the Georgia coast defines me professionally, but also personally. And being here is just, it wasn't always intentional, but it's definitely something that God has led me down the path to be.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I
Yeah.
think before we get started this morning, you also have a reading that you're going to share with us.
Oh, I do, yeah. Louisiana Tech.
I was going to say, you did bring your coffee, so you've met all the checkpoints that you needed to.
Well, I was wondering if coffee and something stronger meant I was supposed to bring something stronger, but I guess that's the spirit, right?
I just was leaving it open in case people have had a hard week.
Maybe if you had this in the afternoon, it'd be different. So kind of in the vein of this whole idea of justice, I chose to do a section of the reading that John Lewis wrote in his letter that was published right after he died. It was this, you can find this in the New York Times, July 30th, 2020. There's an amazing reading of this that I highly recommend. It's extremely powerful, but I can't read the whole thing because I get choked up, so I'm just going to read a section of it. Okay. Though I was surrounded by 2 loving parents, plenty of brothers, sisters, and cousins, their love could not protect me from the unholy oppression waiting just outside the family circle. Unchecked, unrestrained, violence and government-sanctioned terror had the power to turn a simple stroll to the store for some Skittles or an innocent morning jog down a lonely country road into a nightmare. If we are to survive as one unified nation, we must discover what so readily takes root in our hearts that could rob Mother Emanuel Church in South Carolina of her brightest and best, shoot unwitting concert goers in Las Vegas, and choke to death the hopes and dreams of a gifted violinist like Elijah McClain. Like so many young people today, I was searching for a way out, or some might say a way in. And then I heard the voice of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on the radio. He was talking about the philosophy and discipline of nonviolence. He said we are all complicit when we tolerate injustice. He said it is not enough to say it will get better by and by. He said each of us has a moral obligation to stand up, and speak out. When you see something that is not right, you must say something. You must do something. Democracy is not a state. It is an act, and each generation must do its part to help build what we call the beloved community, a nation and world society at peace with itself. Ordinary people with extraordinary vision can redeem the soul of America by getting in what I call good trouble, necessary trouble. Voting and participating in the democratic process are key. The vote is the most powerful nonviolent change agent you have in a democratic society. You must use it because it is not guaranteed you can lose it. You must also study and learn the lessons of history because humanity has been involved in this soul-wrenching existential struggle for a very long time. People on every continent have stood in your shoes through decades and centuries before you. The truth does not change, and that is why the answers worked out long ago can help you find solutions to the challenges of our time. Continue to build union between movements stretching across the globe because we must put away our willingness to profit from the exploitation of others. Though I may not be here with you, I urge you to answer the highest calling of your heart and stand up for what you truly believe. In my life, I've done all I can do to demonstrate that the way of peace, the way of love, and nonviolence is a more excellent way. Now it is your turn to let freedom ring.
Thank you
John Lewis.
for bringing that hero, John Lewis. Well, I wanted to start after that. Well, first, why that? Why did you bring that, and why is it important to you?
Yeah. Well, it's such an interesting time in U.S. history where we have unbelievable atrocities that are being seen by everybody, atrocities on communities of color, people of color. And communities are responding in a way that is new to me and your generation. But John Lewis's message is a message of hope. It's a message of what can happen when people come together. It's a message of unity. And to me, it really represents a demonstration of why it's important for people to come together. And it actually reminds me a lot, when I was reading through that and thinking through what reading I should bring, I could not do it. You know, I can't read the whole thing because, you know, he passed away and it's very sad and we lost a legend. But his message again is of hope and unity. And it reminded me a lot of the message that our CEO, 100 Mile CEO, Megan DeRogers, gave at the conference, the Choosing to Lead conference that you and I spoke at earlier in the spring. And I don't know if you remember, but in that, in her opening remarks, Megan talked a lot about how in 1970, when Earth Day first began, it was a year when the EPA was created. It was a year when the National Environmental Policy Act was adopted. And between 1964 and 1972, 6 major environmental and social justice laws were passed by Congress. It's something that I can't imagine that happening today. Yet there was such a unified movement towards justice during that time that it demonstrates what can happen. Megan goes on in her remarks to talk about how, unfortunately, a divide started shortly after the time frame when those laws were passed, when the environmental community was separated and divided from the civil rights and the social justice community. And a lot of it was around, you know, anti-regulation. It was around the fact that, you know, you couldn't love owls and have jobs. And it was either owls or jobs. It was the environmental groups versus the labor unions. Even in Christian circles, oftentimes the attitude towards the earth was that human rights were elevated above God's other, you know, good creation. And, you know, when it comes to racial issues, the majority of the people that have been involved in the environmental movement are you and me, middle-class white people who are not comfortable really talking about the issues of race. And so we let it happen. We allowed it to happen. We allowed this divide to happen. And so it has brought us, which brings me back to the message that Congressman Lewis gave. We have to come back together because injustice is injustice, whether it's environmental, social, civic. It is our responsibility really to build this movement together and to not allow environmental injustice to continue to impact communities of color, for the civil rights and the environmental rights community to come together to really call for change. And again, that message of hope really rings true. And I think we need it at this stage in the United States history.
Yeah, what you said was interesting. I mean, so we know both that the environmental community that's often lifted up and most easily seen does in fact look like us, and yet there's this history and movement right beneath the surface of communities of color and Black communities who've been doing that work for quite some time, and especially grassroots organizations who aren't lifted up in the work that they're doing. And also the move to split sort of environmental care, creation care, tree plantings and river cleanups from the other side of the coin, which is more environmental justice related, public health related, definitely related to intentional moves on making people of certain races bear the brunt of environmental degradation more from the other. So that there are ways in which people could be environmentalists and care about the outdoors, but weren't necessarily taking action to dismantle some of the systemic issues that perpetuate environmental injustice on these larger scales. I think both of those things are really important that you lifted up. We have worked together a lot in a bunch of different ways, and but one of the primary ways that we work together is kind of tag teaming, doing some environmental presentations in congregations. And I know that for you, your religious background is really important in what you do. And so I wonder if you talk a little bit, you mentioned some of it earlier, but a bit more about how your religious tradition influences your environmental work, and how that, are there special lenses that help you do that work differently? What tools does your tradition allow you to bring to that work?
I wish I could say that my profession is a result of my hard work, and where I am today is the result of me working hard and being successful. But honestly, everything that I have, I can attribute to God's work in my life. Nothing. It's so crazy because you think about plans that you have when you're in college and you're going to save the world. My mom always said, oh, you think you're going to save the world. Well, of course I'm going to save the world when I'm in college. But none of those plans ever worked out, right? But we are so, to have the opportunity to work for an organization like 100 Miles right now, and have an opportunity to help start the organization from scratch, and to have the family that I have, everything has been kind of God's grand plan. It sucks right now, to be honest. As a working parent, it's really hard living in a time of COVID with 4 kids in school and trying to balance all of the craziness of homeschooling and life. And so, I think I often go back to the influence of my faith in my work. I go back to the beginning. God called earth good. God called creation good. And then he created man and woman to tend the earth. And so my primary responsibility right now is to care for my family. And my primary responsibility in my profession is to care for God's good earth. And so I really do, I find a lot of strength in going back to that premise. And I think one of the things that we as community members and as Christians have to remember is that it's not just us. By the grace of God, we are here today, and it is not, we really don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, but it's all in his hands, and we can do the best that we can. We can fight bad ideas. We can fight bad ideas with love. We can fight bad ideas civilly. But it is our responsibility to fight bad ideas and to promote great ideas, and to do that in love. And I think those are all Christian teachings that I learned as a kid and have carried forward to this day. Just kind of, when all hope seems lost, you kind of give it up and say, I've done the best I can. God, it's up to you now. And that's, as a professional, sometimes we have a lot of trouble addressing that and acknowledging that. But I think as a Christian, we have to have hope that it's all going to work out.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that. Even if you wanted to take the most literalist read that you could take, there's a whole bunch of stuff that gets created and called good before human beings.
Yeah.
Right? There's a whole long list of stuff that is pretty good and that God has an older relationship with than human beings, which I think is important to remember.
Yeah. Well, and another, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. So another thing that that I will bring up is that before we got on the live feed, you mentioned how long I've been in this field, and I appreciate that, Cody, because I've been in this field for a long time. But it seems that the longer I'm in this field, the more people that I meet who, like me, got into it because we love being outside. We love the environment. We love trees and the coast and the marshes. But when we think about caring for God's good earth, it's not just about caring for environment. Caring for the environment is caring for people as well. And you had mentioned the work that we've done before together, working on issues of toxins. On the Georgia coast, we have a pretty significant legacy of toxic contamination, and it's one of the biggest challenges that we as a community face. And people struggle because God's world is not what He intended it to be, and we are not doing what we as humans are not tending the earth as well as we should. And so I think we're creating a lot more harm for people through our damage to the environment than good in a lot of situations. And so it makes this work even more important to think through that lens, that it's not just about the trees and the marshes, it's about the people that depend on that as well.
Yeah, it's a good segue. So earlier you you talked about how the passion isn't enough, that it takes strategy. And I think in line with that, you know, from a faith-based perspective, that it's not enough to appreciate or pray about it necessarily or have some rituals that honor it, but it actually is this sort of call to get your hands dirty and begin to get to work and protecting people in the environment in a variety of ways. And I wonder, you know, you mentioned the toxins, which we can dive into a bit more, but how this work on environment directly intersects with the call to care for neighbor that I think that you've talked about here and you've talked about before, that intersection between it's not enough to care for just the created world, but actually how it impacts neighbor.
Yeah, I mentioned I grew up in a small town in Louisiana, and one of the things that I was taught was to never challenge, never ask questions. You know, just I was a pretty shy kid, so that wasn't a big deal. And so when I got into the advocacy world, and I learned that I learned from gifted lobbyists. I learned from people who've been in the field for a long time and actually were challenging bad ideas, but in a civil and loving way. The roles that communities have in their future is quite significant. The trouble that we find, though, with issues of toxins and environmental injustice is that the majority of the people that are affected by toxic legacies and even sea level rise are lower income, even communities of color. The people that are least able to really take the time to go to a community meeting or to offer a public comment on an expansion of, say, a landfill or a Superfund site cleanup plan. And so when 100 Miles was organized, we committed to being a grassroots organization that would work with communities to try to raise up community leaders and help provide the tools that individuals need to make to help their communities make better decisions about the environment in which they live. And that was grassroots organizing, I think, is one of the most important tools that a community has, because a citizen's voice to an elected official means so much more than say my voice coming from an organization or somebody that works in the field professionally. But a lot of times folks just don't know how to, where the opportunities are to engage or how to make that strategic decision. So one of the things that we are very intentional about doing is working with community leaders so that it's not our voice that's heard, but it's the voice of the community members themselves.
Yeah, you mentioned 100 Miles being an explicitly grassroots organization, and I think you've definitely demonstrated that in a ton of ways. I think the things that come to mind are sort of the breadth at which you were able to work with communities across the state on offshore drilling resolutions was really, really impressive. And I know that it's been a new feature or an ongoing feature of 100 Miles' work to work with counties and cities about disaster resilience kind of planning. And I wonder if you talk a little bit about the resilience planning and some of the unique challenges that face Georgia's coast as we think about climate change and sea level rise, and also how that intersects with some of the justice issues, right? Because it's not, I think oftentimes people inland will say, well, why don't people will just leave, and they'll relocate and that's fine. And so when we're talking about disaster preparedness and resilience, we're also talking about who can afford to leave and who can't, and who bears the brunt of the cost and the design for some of these resilience measures. So I wonder if you just talk a little bit about that.
Well, the fact of the matter is it's not unique to the Georgia coast, is that sea levels are rising. On the Georgia coast, sea level has risen 8 to 10 inches over the past 80 years. That's about 3 millimeters a year. And we're also seeing an increase in the number of high tide events. When we first moved here back in 2009, I'd never heard the term king tides. But a king tide happens almost every other high tide cycle now. And on the Georgia coast, we have two daily inundations of high tide. And so those major, those recurring high tide events not only affect the human communities that are built close to or in low-lying areas, but also the wildlife. Again, my husband is a bird biologist, and we just had the storm that came through, the tropical storm that passed through, and thankfully didn't do any major damage on the Georgia coast, but it washed over a majority of the seabird nests that were here. And so when we look at the challenges of sea level rise, and you asked about the uniqueness of the Georgia coast, I really do think the situation we're finding ourselves in, particularly in Glenn County, is the situation with the Superfund sites. None of the cleanup plans that we have reviewed or been engaged in offering comments on consider the fact that seas have risen up to 10 inches in 80 years. And so these cleanup plans are not going to be quick. They're going to be in place for 30 or so years. And to not consider rising seas, what you're doing is allowing the contaminants to spread far beyond where they are now. A lot of our contamination here in Glenn County is in our marshes. And in particular, one of the sites in Glenn County is one of the largest in the country. It's an 800-acre site owned by Honeywell, a multi-billion-dollar international company, and it's contaminated with PCBs. The cleanup plan that they have in place for getting those PCBs out of the marshes involves putting a thin layer of sand over the marshes in the hopes that it will contain them. It's just not, it's not good enough. And so what we're doing is making a perpetual problem even worse for future communities. And we're talking about contaminants that affect the neurological abilities of humans, especially unborn children. There are some cancer-causing chemicals that are in our marshes as well. And one of the things that 100 Miles has done is an initiative called Creating Our Adaptation Strategy Together, or COAST. COAST was an initiative led by my colleague, Alex. and where we went around to communities throughout Glynn County and we asked the community, what are the priorities? What are the areas that you see are most in need of protection, and what are some things that you think might work? And we were able to create a local strategy for addressing some of these challenges, and a lot of them actually do deal with dealing with the contamination in these lower income communities. And it's something that we are implementing now through our work with the federal agencies, but also through our work in the communities. It helps prioritize our efforts, looking at brownfield redevelopment, looking into better alternatives for cleaning up these contaminants, and leadership opportunities for the local governments to do. So those are some of the things that we've been able to do in the community here in Glynn County. And again, it is a very unique situation. Another uniqueness of our situation, actually, I want to say it's more of an opportunity, and I would love to get your feedback on this. But one of the things that make us so unique as a coast is that we're pretty rural. You know, Georgia's coast is 100 miles long, which is how our organization got our name. 50% of the counties on the Georgia coast are still forested. We have 14 major barrier islands. Only 4 of those are accessible by car. And for the most part, I've heard that there are roughly a third of the remaining salt marsh on the East Coast are housed in Georgia. Majority of those marshes and the inland wetlands actually are lands that were crafted and carved out by Africans who were brought over against their will. So we have this amazing rural landscape that has this history and this legacy that was crafted by the ingenuity and hard work of Africans. A lot of the descendants of those Africans still live and reside in the Georgia coast. And so as we think about sea level and the impact it's going to have not only on our environment, but also the built environment, we have to consider the impact that it's having on the legacy and the history that the African Americans now have. And the fact that a majority of the conservation efforts on the Georgia coast have been very successful, but history and culture are often an afterthought in conservation issues. And I think we have the unique challenge to protect that heritage as we think through adaptation plans for sea level rise, as we think through priority areas for conservation or wildlife corridors. I think it's our job to eliminate that trend of doing conservation for the environment first and then heritage, but really bring them together. It's really our obligation as a coastal community that really is built around these landscapes that wouldn't be here were it not for the Africans that were brought over.
Yeah, I have a lot of questions to ask you about all the things that you just said. But one, I think that struck me, and then I think is important to elaborate on a little bit, is really when you say the Georgia coast seas have risen maybe 8 to 10 inches over 80 years, which I think is what you said. It's easy to hear that number and say, well, that's not a lot. And so could you help us understand what the impact of that is? It sounds like a small number, but in reality, in the way that it functions, is not necessarily.
It does sound like a small number. And I think when you put it in a global scale, it's really hard to wrap your arms around. So to bring it home, I think you can think through, you can think about a low-lying community, and wherever you live, you can think about river basins. I got a degree, my whole focus, my professional career has been around water. And so I think around watersheds and I think around wetlands. And so a lot of the development that has happened over the past 40 years in particular has put high density housing developments in high velocity not necessarily high density, but has allowed development to occur in high intensity storm zones. And so the development that's occurred over the past 40 or so years is in areas where we're having a greater impact from storms. Those areas may not be as directly affected by rising seas, but as those storms come in, we're allowing, they're causing more damage. The sea level rise impact, I think, comes from the fact that we are allowing more development in low-lying areas, and particularly low-income developments. When we pave over areas, we create more stormwater. The stormwater has to have somewhere to go, and when you have a coastal environment, stormwater doesn't go anywhere but to a drain or to a ditch. Those ditches lead through low-lying neighborhoods and often cause more and more flooding for those lower income communities. We're seeing it every time there's a king tide, or a tide that's 10 feet above sea level, above mean sea level here in Glenn County. There was a time until about 5 years ago when actually we would have these high tide events, and the water would come up through the storm drains and flood downtown Brunswick, and you could see it. It was just the whole streets, the major downtown streets, would be covered in seawater. They've thankfully put in some gates in the storm drains, so that doesn't happen as much anymore. But I do believe our development practices are allowing major negative impacts to our communities, because we're not acknowledging that seas are rising, flooding is increasing, and that the water has to go somewhere, and it goes to those low-lying areas.
I know there are tons of communities in Brunswick that experience that and are usually, like you said, low income or communities of color, Black communities that are situated in these sort of low-lying areas, or areas in which much of the permeable surfaces are no more. And I wonder if you could also briefly touch on, I think some of the work that you've all been doing has also intersected with how insurance plays into some of these developments. And I wonder if you could just mention, because it's not just you build a bunch of buildings in storm areas and they get damaged and you're like, oh, well, that's fine, we'll just build them back, because there seems to be now this ripple effect in insurers, how much insurance will cost, whether they will even insure some of these buildings on the coast because of the very issue that you're saying.
You talk to any community member in Brunswick or on the coast, and they always talk about the increase of insurance, and flood insurance in particular. And so I do think that the insurance industry has a major role to play in where developments occur, where we allow communities to cite certain developments. For the longest time, it was all about, this is my property, I have a right to do whatever I want to do in them. But the reality is the conditions have changed so much that if you build in certain areas, you're increasing the risk that the people who buy those buildings or reside there are going to be harmed. And so I think you're absolutely right. The insurance industry has a major role to play in stepping up and helping communities understand the true risk of building in low-lying areas and in high-risk areas from hurricanes or major storm events.
Yeah. There's so many questions that I have left, and our time is coming to a close. I'll shift briefly to see if you could tell us a little bit about what has been happening with the iterations of attempts to get mining in the Okefenoke. And I know that you all have been involved with that in different ways, and we have tried to assist when we can. And so I wonder if you just brief the audience on what that process has been like and where that stands.
Yeah. So, Cody, you've been to the Okefenoke, haven't you?
I have paddled it, and I would highly recommend that everyone paddle it and spend some nights on the Okefenoke Swamp.
That's what I wanted to hear. So, Okefenoke is just a magical place, and it is the largest blackwater swamp in North America. Sits at roughly over 400,000 acres and is situated in southeast Georgia. It was basically created by a high area, and it's hard to imagine this. I wish I had a map. There's a map here. But it was basically the eastern boundary of the Okefenoke Swamp is the old coastline of Georgia. And it is a kind of, if you look at the linear stretch of it, it looks like a series of islands, which it used to be. And that geological formation is known as Trail Ridge. And so Trail Ridge forms the eastern boundary that holds back all of the water, creates the habitats for the wildlife and the unique plant life that are Okefenoke. It was designated a national um, reserve, what's the term? Sorry, I just lost it. National refuge, wildlife refuge, back in the 1930s, because it's so unique. It had already been logged by that point, but there were a lot of people who were worried that the logging was going to disrupt the wildlife, and went in and actually documented the trees and the plants and the amphibians and the mammals that were out there. So we have this long record of the ecosystem as it is. But the Okefenoke Swamp itself wouldn't exist were it not for Trail Ridge. And there is a proposal that the federal government is considering right now to mine for titanium in Trail Ridge, right next to the Okefenoke Swamp. Basically, what they want to do is to pull up, dig down about 50. I'm losing my train of thought. But the mine will basically dig down into Trail Ridge, pull up the minerals, run them through the mining process, and pull out titanium, and then put back the sediments into the Trail Ridge area. It sounds fairly innocuous, but one of the things that we have learned from our hydrogeologists is that Trail Ridge is not a unified body of sand. It has all these defining layers and that create the structure that basically hold the water in. It is also the area where they're planning to mine is also the headwaters of the St. Mary's River. And the St. Mary's River forms the southern boundary between Georgia and Florida. It's also, the St. Mary's River is home to sturgeon that are endangered species. And so if you affect the flow into the St. Mary's River, you affect the sturgeon habitat and could have a major impact on this federally endangered species. So there's been a group of organizations, both national and statewide and local, that have formed the Okefenoke Protection Alliance, or OPA, in an effort to fight that mine. As it's proposed, it could do irreversible harm to the swamp. And the company that's proposing it has not been willing to collect the amount of data needed to do the types of modeling necessary to demonstrate the impact the mine would have. They've not looked at ample alternatives to what they propose to do. And so this organization, or this alliance, OPA, is really organized to protect the swamp. And right now, the biggest threat to the swamp is this mine. Back in the 1990s, there was another proposal by DuPont to mine along Trail Ridge. And after 3 years of unbelievable public outrage and opposition, DuPont actually walked away from their mining proposal and donated the lands that they had proposed to mine on for permanent conservation. And so, that type of end result is definitely possible when communities come together and can fight a bad idea. So.
I think what's important too about what you said is, your work and your work within coalitions on offshore drilling. It's definitely the same working on some of our projects with Superfund sites in Glenn County. It's surely that way with the mining, is that it requires consistent attention over a long period of time, even when you don't have the attention to give it. That you get it in check, but you never quite get it in check permanently. And it requires you to always keep an eye out for it, because truly the love of money is the root of all evil. And there are plenty of people who are seeking to mine and destroy all sorts of things to be able to profit off of it. So thank you for both briefing us on that and the work that 100 Miles is doing on that. I wanted to close with asking the question that I've ended. Well, no, actually, I'm going to ask you this other question first, because I know how much of canoe and kayaking enthusiast you are being on the water. And so I did want for everyone who is at home and thinking about how to spend some of their quarantine pandemic time, what's the best spot to be on the water? Is it the Satilla?
Oh yeah, hands down.
Yeah, that's your spot. Do you have a particular point on the river that you think like that's the best spot?
I do. So my family loves to put our canoes and our kayaks in at Deep Bend Landing. It's a privately owned boat launch in Atkinson, Georgia, just off of Highway 259. Highly recommend it. The owner is, I think, a seventh generation landowner in that area, and he knows a lot about the spot. But it's again, for a family of 6 with small children, we have to have manageable paddling. And so the big water is not really always an option. So this at Deep Bend Landing, the river is small enough to where our young kids can actually paddle themselves, and then we can find a sandbar. Even during some of the high water events, we can find a sandbar and play around and flop around. And it's I'd heard that there might be an effort underway to designate the Satilla River a recreation body of water, which I think would be awesome. Right now, it's just fishing, designated a fishing body of water. So we would support that 100% because we're in it all the time.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Now I'll ask you the question that I ask everybody else, which is, what are you missing the most in this COVID-19 world, and what are you clinging to that gives you hope?
Ooh, good question. I miss working with people. You know, I really struggle. I love you, Cody, and I love interacting like this, but I want to sit across from you and I want to have this conversation across from you.
Yeah.
And I do miss seeing people and doing the work in the communities that is so needed, and honestly, it's fulfilling. I think the communities in coastal Georgia, when 100 Miles was founded, when my husband and I first moved here, I recognized early on, coming from Atlanta, that not a lot of people talked about the environment, and not a lot of people talked about the need to protect it. Everybody, you see wildlife around every corner, and you see, you know, the water and the marshes, and they're just spectacular. You know, the Golden Isles has its name because it's beautiful, and so many people really want to be here. But not a lot of people were talking about the need for protecting it. And so grassroots organizing is people, and getting out and working with people face to face is something that I really dearly miss. And I also miss working. Honestly, I'm spending so much time with my kids. I love them, but you know, it's really difficult, honestly, to try to balance the work life situation that so many working families are struggling with right now. And so COVID has thrown regular work schedules, regular work routines, and just the value of face-to-face interactions totally out the door. And it's a real struggle, to be honest. So I cannot wait for it to go away, but I don't think it's happening anytime soon. So we just have to keep up this kind of thing.
Well, thank you for being on here and taking some time to come on the show and share about your life and your work. I wanted to close with a reading which became very important when I started doing work in Glenn County, and it seems very appropriate that I will at least read a short excerpt from the Marshes of Glenn, because that seems like what should happen here. So I'm just going to read probably what is the latter fourth or the latter third. It picks up, it says, "Behold, I will build me a nest on the greatness of God. I will fly in the greatness of God as the marsh hen flies, in the freedom that fills the space twixt the marsh and the skies, by so many roots as the marsh grass sends in the sod. I will heartily lay me a hold on the greatness of God. Oh, like to the greatness of God is the greatness within the range of the marshes, the liberal marshes of Glen. And the sea lends large as the marsh, lo, out of his plenty the sea pours fast. Full soon the time of the flood tide must be. Look how the grace of the sea doth go about and about through the intricate channels that flow here and there, everywhere, till his waters have flooded the uttermost creeks and the low-lying lanes, and the marsh is meshed with a million veins, that like as with rosy and silvery essences flow in the rose and silver evening glow. Farewell, my lord sun. The creeks overflow, 1,000 rivulets run twixt the roots of the sod, the blades of the marsh grass stir. Passeth a hurrying sound of wings that westward were, passeth, and all is still, and the currents cease to run. And the sea and the marsh are one. How still the plains of the waters be. The tide is in his ecstasy, the tide is at his highest height, and it is night. And now from the vast of the Lord will the waters of sleep roll in on the souls of men. But who will reveal to our waking kin the forms that swim and the shapes that creep under the waters of sleep? And I would I could know what swimmeth below when the tides come in on the length and the breadth of the marvelous marshes of Glen. Thank you so much again, everyone, for tuning in. Thank you again, Alice, for being here. You can catch us same time, same place next week. I'll be interviewing Kalia Martin with the Climate Reality Project. Thanks so much.